What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Track Garb Session. It's been so long since I've posted a video. I do apologize. I have been working on the car, but due to bad weather and other things that have happened, it's just been really difficult to film everything and get it edited and get it up. But I'm just going to basically show you some random footage of the things that I've done to get us up to this point. I've done this over the last month or so in just little periods, so it's not going to flow real well. I do apologize. I may do some voiceover in this just to kind of keep the congruency correct and try and get it to flow a little bit. But anyway, we've got the car basically all done, and so I'm going to show you all the footage now of how we got up to this point, and then we're going to go ahead and get the car started, or try and get it started. Alright guys, well, we're going to start this video off with a little bit of a voiceover here. What I'm showing you right now is just the components that I'm using for the oil cooler setup. Now, you don't have to use an oil cooler when you're swapping in an LFX. It doesn't have one in the Camaro or in Cadillac, or in whichever car the engine normally came in. But because the Mazda has a couple of them, why not go ahead and use one, especially since my car in particular is going to be used for autocross. It's also going to be used for a normal track day, that kind of stuff. So having an oil cooler will help keep engine temperatures down and hopefully reduce the wear on the engine. So I'm doing a poor job here of showing you the components. I thought I had it in screen, but apparently I was off just a little bit. But the parts that I'm using, the first piece is a Moroso oil filter sandwich adapter. It's got two ports, AN10 I think ports that are on it. So I needed adapters for those to go to the AN fittings, which I have there in the background. I've also got M18, I think 1.5 thread pitch for the factory RX-8 oil cooler that goes to a -10 AN fitting, and then a couple sections, 3-foot sections of nylon braided hose that's rated for oil. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you where and kind of how I installed the oil filter sandwich adapter on the side of the engine, and then running the lines down and attaching the other ends to the factory oil cooler. Alright, so hopefully you can see this here. This is the billet oil filter piece that's in the Chrysler automation kit. I've got the Mazda oil pressure sensor, the Camaro oil pressure sensor, and then the adapter here. I've the oil filter sandwich adapter, which I'm going to have to clock a little bit down, and I'm going to go ahead and actually plug in the Camaro oil pressure sensor, the plug onto this, so I can see how much clearance I have. But the lines are going to run right along here up against the frame rail, and I'll get some standoff mounts that's designed to hold AN fittings, and then it's going to run down here in the front footwell. So then the lines are going to come down along here on that rail, and then we're going to go ahead and figure out where we need to cut these hoses and put the adapters on them, or put the fittings on them that are 90 degrees, and go ahead and bolt them in here, and then we can finish tightening everything up on that adapter. Alright, well, there's the finished product. We've gotten these all tightened up. I'm going to jump under the car and tighten that sandwich oil filter adapter, and then throw the oil filter on, and then the entire oiling system is done. Alright, the first thing I'm actually going to do before we jump on the ECU is actually going to be our fuel line. I still have a little bit of the harness back here that I got to button up. I'm actually going to throw in a flex fuel sensor, a GM flex fuel sensor, and I just needed to figure out where, on the firewall I was going to mount this. Now we're going to skip this right now, just because I'm not going to be tuning it for E85 in the near future. So I'm going to get the connector hooked in to the harness, but we won't be running the fuel through the sensor yet. So this is the actual fuel line that you get with the Chrysler swap kit, and so it's really simple. With the RX-8 fuel system, you've got a basically a returnless style fuel system, so you don't have to run a line all the way back to the pump, because you have built into the pump assembly, you have a basically a fuel pressure regulator that dumps excess fuel once it's reached the proper fuel pressure to the line. It dumps the excess pressure or fuel right back into the fuel system, right back into the tank. So the only thing that you really have to do is run a 3/8 quick connect fitting down to the factory fuel line that comes up here, and then a 180 degree connector here, because the Camaro fuel line points off this direction. So we're actually just going to snap this on back here. And run it over to that side. And then plug it in right there on our fuel line that feeds into the high pressure fuel pump on the back of the engine. So that's it for the fuel system. There's no other modifications that you got to make. So now that we have that done, we're going to jump over here to mounting the ECU. Alright guys, well, before we mount the ECU box, just want to let you know this piece back here actually bolts to the top of the strut tower, where the strut tower brace used to mount. On the video where I showed you when I was mounting the coilovers, this is the piece that I was talking about, bolting down to the top of that factory piece. I've also installed the catch can that I installed on the previous car. If you want to see that video, I'll link it up in the video. I'll link that up in this video so that you can watch that, but I just mounted it in the exact same place. The hoses were already measured to that length, and that's really the best place that I've found for it. So now that we've got all this figured out, I've still got to loom some of this wire, but we'll be able to get this mounted in and installed first. So the first thing that we're going to do, this wiring right here is for the Camaro ECU, which will actually sit on top of this Mazda ECU box. These wires have got to run back into the base of this box, and then this is going to run in on this side. This is where your crank sensor, oil pressure, temperature, and all that stuff go through. So in order to mount this, we actually have to make a little bit of modifications to this box. This loop right here is for hooking the AC line that runs up to the condenser, and then this piece is actually the top. There's actually a piece here on the bottom and on the top where one of the mounts or the screws are to secure the top onto this, and it's so tight here with this new engine that when you try and set this down in place, this actually hits the side of the cylinder head or the valve cover. So what we have to do is modify this with a Dremel or a little hacksaw, as well as cut off this loop here that gets in the way, and what you end up with is something like this. So as you can see, it's not a huge difference. You're basically leaving enough here so that you still can put the bolt down and secure it, but it gives enough space there so that this will fit right down in there, and then you get rid of that that loop. So I would just throw this in instead of doing the modification again to another ECU box, but this one's in so much better condition. It's got some of the clips and stuff that that this has had broken off over the years, I guess. So I'm going to go ahead and make that modification, and then we'll slap this thing down in and get the ECUs mounted up. Alright, so we've got the ECU box installed. I've got the power steering control module and the ECU all plugged in, and then I just snapped the top cover back on here. So now we're on to the final piece of the computer system, and that is the Camaro ECU. Now this ECU is provided in the Keisler automation kit. Now it's nothing more than a Camaro LFX ECU that they have basically plugged into I think it's HP tuners, where you can turn off the body control module, and it needing to have, you know, a programmed chip key for anti-theft and all that stuff. So that way we can put it into another car and start it up without it having to look for all those modules and running into issues. So, you know, if you're doing this kind of swap in a different car, you'll need to tune that out of the ECU. But that's already done for us. And so we just need to mount it here. Now, this is actually a perfect spot for it to mount. There's just enough room. But unfortunately, as you can see, the ECU itself doesn't have any kind of mount from GM. I don't know how they have it mounted in a Camaro. It might have like a little slot that it pops into and then clips in. I'm not sure, but Keisler Automation has come up with a pretty clever design where instead of using just normal bolts to bolt down the top of this ECU box, they've actually added extended bolts and then 3D printed these pieces that will fit perfectly into the fins of the heatsink on the ECU. So there's 3 mounts. We'll go ahead and bolt this down and plug in the ECU, and then all that we have to do is hook up the intake and then fill it with coolant. Alright, now I just put these 2 mounts in because this wire that I ran that goes down to the knock sensor and the GM crankshaft positioning sensor actually ran it down the wrong way. So it's in the way of this last mount over here, and I'm either going to have to pull up this whole box or undo those sensors or the connectors on the sensors, pull it back up and run it down the back way, and then that way I can clean all this up. It's too tight to squeeze that through there. So but I want to get this thing started, so we are going to go ahead and have it mounted like this. That's going to be fine for right now. The only other thing that we have to do now is to go ahead and install the intake manifold. Not the intake manifold, the actual intake. Alright, so the last piece that we need to install is the intake here, and what's included is a 3D printed tube that will hold your mass airflow sensor and the vacuum tube for your PCV system. Alright, so that we've got that tightened on now. Now normally the mass airflow sensor wire would come down here, but I've got some aluminum piping and some pieces. We're going to end up making a custom intake for it. So while I had the wiring undone here, I went ahead and pulled it out from being back there, so that way we'll have enough room anytime we need to you know, move the MAF around. So right now I'm just going to push it up under here. Lock it into place. And then now that we've got that all done, go ahead and hook the catch can back up here. But we've got this breather hose connection and then one on the back of the driver's side or left side valve cover, which will actually feed the it'll pull the air in from the intake once it's already been measured, and then that's what ends up going through your catch can and then back into the intake manifold. So it's all metered air. Well, I'll just connect it on here right now so that we can start it. It looks like it's going to need to be cut just a little bit. And then same with this piece, the vacuum line to the brake master cylinder or the brake booster. So we've got all this plugged in. So the only thing that we have to do now is start filling up the coolant. a few days ago, off camera, I actually took out the spark plugs and sprayed in some oil and filled the engine with the motor oil. So I hand cranked it to make sure none of the cylinders were seized. I don't know how long this thing sat in the salvage yard before I bought it, and if you've been watching this channel for a little while, you'll know it's been about a year since I purchased this engine and I still haven't run it. So normally you'd want to get oil into the cylinders, like a fogging oil or something, before you store it. I didn't have that option. So anyway, I did make sure that they all turn over, and I turned it over several times with a wrench just to make sure it was all lubricated with the oil in the cylinders. Now, before we start it, what I'm going to do is remove the fuel pump fuse or relay. That way that we can go ahead and crank it several times to get the fuel pressure built, or not the fuel pressure, the oil pressure built up, have it fill the oil cooler lines and the oil cooler itself, make sure our oil level is good, make sure that oil is put through every little part of the engine. Then we'll connect the fuel relay or fuse back in, and then we'll go ahead and see if she starts up for us. Alright guys, so most of you, or some of you, may have noticed that the hood hasn't been shut for a while, and it's not because I just haven't felt like shutting it and having to reopen it. It's because I literally cannot shut it and latch it. As soon as we put the engine in and put the intake manifold on top, it's been too tall to actually shut the hood. And the only issue is right here on the front of the motor, where the throttle body and everything is, it actually sits too tall just a little bit. But luckily we don't have to cut the entire hood, so the engine's not going to be sticking out like some, you know, redneck type of setup. It's going to actually shut, but we're going to have to take out the inner skin. So I've already pulled out the like fire retardation blanket and taken that off. So all we got to do now is take off the hood. I'm going to set it down on a trash can, just mark out where we need to cut it up, and then as you can see here, there's dimples up underneath the hood, and those are actually there's like an epoxy that's between those and the outer skin of the hood, and that's just to keep the thing solid for good rigidity and everything, because this is aluminum, so it's really lightweight. So what we got to do, cut around that, and then we're going to use a heat gun to heat up that epoxy and pull the inner section of skin out that we don't need. Alright, so for the first step of this process, I've actually got a little bit of an outline marked out there on the hood. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and use the cutoff wheel to go ahead and cut around that section, and then we'll use a heat gun to pull up those dimple areas. Alright, so maybe you can see this now. It's all cut around here. Now we'll have to clean up these edges once we get this all finished and this piece pulled out. But the only things holding these this piece in is this dimple right here in the middle, and this dimple right here. See this? So see, this is actually these dimples are pressed in, and then there's an epoxy or something that's put down between this and the outer skin, and that just makes this really solid while keeping this whole thing extremely lightweight. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and get the heat gun out. I'm going to grab this with pliers, or I may not even need to, because these little holes actually make for a pretty good hand grip, but just kind of pull on it a little bit while you heat it up. Now you don't want to heat it too much, and you don't want to pull it too hard, because you don't want to warp or bend anything on the outside of the hood. So we're just going to take it pretty slow, just going to hit it with the heat gun and just start pulling, and this should just pop right off. Alright, so there it is. It literally took like 60 seconds. So there were just these pieces here, these little this, like I said, like an epoxy or a rubber like glue that held those dimples in, and just using the heat gun and making sure, you know, obviously when you use the heat gun, that you hit it directly on these spots. You don't want to get anywhere below that, and while you do that, you just pull up you know, firmly, but not to the point where you're gonna bend that outside sheet metal. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go ahead and test fit the hood, and as long as it works, then we're gonna go ahead and clean up all these edges so that it's not sharp, and go ahead and put it back on the car. All right guys, well I had to keep going back and forth a few times, mounting it on the car, lowering it, seeing where it's still catching, and after doing it a few times I just kind of got sick of it and went ahead and just took out a good amount extra, probably more than I needed to, but as you can see there's still plenty of the hood that still has the bottom section, but it's closing. There's only one little section catching, and that's right where the front of the rotary symbol is on the hood. It's hitting right here on the manifold. So there's some ribbing here for extra rigidity on the intake manifold. So I'm going to go ahead and probably grind that down a little bit. That way when the engine's moving back and forth, I don't have to worry about it bending any part of the hood as it's rubbing up against it. But once that's done, that'll shut just fine. I mean, right now it'll shut, but it's pushing up against there. So with the engine moving, once it's running and everything, I don't want that to cause any issues bending up the hood. So I'm gonna do that off camera. All right, so now that that's done, it's just a matter of tidying up a few things, and then we're gonna go ahead and start driving this car. All right guys, so that leads us to this point in this garage. Why are we here? Well, I'll tell you why we're here in a minute, but first, let's go ahead and try and start it, since that's what you've all been waiting for. All right, well there you have it. She starts. There's no check engine light. So what's the problem? And why are we here in this garage? Well, this is my parents' garage and they're on vacation for a couple weeks, so I figured it'd be a good place for us to do what we gotta do now. Once the engine started, I found out that the transmission doesn't want to go into gear with the engine running, which means that the clutch isn't fully disengaging. Now I've tried rebleeding the clutch. I've tried kind of kick starting the car so that with the clutch being installed on that engine and transmission assembly together for the last year and 4 months, it's possible that the pressure plate being clamped on it has caused the clutch plate to kind of fuse to the flywheel. So that's still a possibility. Kickstarting it the way we did, or basically nudging it back and forth and then starting it in gear and kind of lurching the car forward and trying to get it out of gear and everything, that should break that clutch disc loose if it was fused. And it didn't do anything, and rebleeding it didn't do anything. So even adjusting the Willwood master cylinder didn't do anything. So what that means is we've got to pull the transmission and make sure that either the dimensions of the clutch and flywheel assembly, which are an aftermarket piece from spec, and I've read online that there were some manufacturing issues with some of them. It's possible that the tolerances are incorrect. The other possibility, like I just mentioned, is that the clutch disc is fused, and even, you know, knocking the car back and forth didn't break it loose. It's possible that it is still fused and that we'll have to get it loose and possibly even replace the clutch disc at that point. The other option or possibility is that when it was installed 16 months ago, that the person that installed it when all this stuff was going together possibly installed the clutch disc backwards. There is a small mark on the clutch showing which way is towards the engine, and it is very possible that the person that installed it backwards. And if that's the case, then it could keep the car from allowing the clutch to fully disengage. Even though I can feel the pressure plate fully moving, there's something off there. So basically what we've got to do is pull the transmission and find out why that clutch won't disengage. Hopefully it won't take too long for us to do that. The weather's been really bad outside. It's starting to get nice, but it's been storming today, and it's going to be storming for the next several days. So that's why we have it here in the garage. There's not great lighting, and you guys have seen a transmission before, so I'm not gonna film this unless we run into something crazy, or if you know, there's some other reason why this clutch won't disengage that I figure that you guys should see, and that at that point I will record it. But hopefully this will only take a day or two, and we'll get this thing driving, and then I'll do another video of how the car drives. But right now it's running great. Once this is done, I'm gonna also do the exhaust while it's here, and so that way when it's done here, it's done completely, and then we'll go see how it drives. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your patience, all you subscribers that have stuck around waiting for this to be done. I know it's taken way too long, but such is life, things get in the way. So we'll go ahead and get this taken care of, and I'll give you guys an update soon. Thanks for watching.
Take it easy.